Hi and welcome. This video is part 2 of a series where I expose the plagiarism of the Quran. In part 1, I reviewed a poem in William Tisdale's book, The Original Sources of the Quran, and showed you evidence that Muhammad's Quran has plagiarized lines of poetry from the pre-Islamic poet Imr al-Qais. Muslims, of course, deny the charge Muhammad plagiarized from pre-Islamic poetry, so we need to look at the usual Muslim responses to this problem and refute each one. I will divide these Muslim claims and questions as external evidences and internal evidences. Let's deal with the external ones first. Number 1. Muslims claim nobody ever charged Muhammad with plagiarism. My response is, well, Tisdale himself made that charge. As we see here in the appendix to chapter 2, quote, "It would be difficult to imagine Muhammad venturing to plagiarize from such a well-known author as Imr al-Qais, even though, as we shall see later, he did so from less-known foreign sources." And for Muslims who want to focus on more ancient history, long before Tisdale lived, they ask, how could Muhammad get away with plagiarizing the poetry of the famous Imr al-Qais without historically being accused of plagiarism? Well, I would say Muhammad stole from the lesser-known poems, not the more famous ones, and this could explain why it was unnoticed by others. Tisdale himself indicates this in the appendix to chapter 2, where he says, quote, "These odes formed no part of the mu'allaqat. They were not as generally current as poems contained in the later collection were." In other words, it appears Muhammad has plagiarized from the lesser-known work of Imr al-Qais, which was not part of the famous mu'allaqat collection. These lesser-known verses Muhammad inserted into the Quran, chapter 54, and in other places. And if you're wondering how the less famous poetry of Imr al-Qais got added to an edition of the famous mu'allaqat collection, that's explained here in this Wikipedia article on the mu'allaqat. It's due to the great celebrity status of Imr al-Qais that later scholars would add a poem of his to the mu'allaqat collection, while not intending to make that poem an intrinsic part of that work. Number 2, Muslims also claim the pagan Quraysh tribe were the most knowledgeable people about Arabic poetry, and also the most eager to deny Muhammad. Nevertheless, none of them made such an accusation that Muhammad had taken some of the Quran from Imr al-Qais. Well, I say the Quran itself kind of refutes that argument. I've already shown it repeatedly admits Muhammad was being accused of producing poetry. Think about it. How can an illiterate man who allegedly could not read or write be accused of producing poetry? This charge only makes sense if he was plagiarizing it from someone else. Number 3, some Muslims claim the poem displayed by Tisdale does not exist anywhere in Imr al-Qais's poetry extant today. Well, I'd say that's probably because of the controversy. It's been removed due to fear and intimidation by Islamic authorities. However, we know the poem did exist outside of Persia in Tisdale's time, as he says in a footnote in the appendix to chapter 2, quote, "The Reverend Dr. Zwemmer of Bahrain, however, informs me that he has found the words ذَنَتِ السَّاعَةُ وَانشَقَّ الْقَمَرُ in the last section of the last poem of Imr al-Qais in an edition which he possesses. This shows that in the early 20th century, the poem had been found both in Iran and Bahrain, so it wasn't completely wiped out of existence." Number 4, Muslims say the poem has no original written manuscript. I respond by saying, so what? Poetry in pre-Islamic times was memorized and passed down by oral transmission, and was only written down later. This is not a good excuse for Muslims to use, because the Quran was also first transmitted orally and written down later. Based on this argument, Muslims would have to reject the Quran also, due to the absence of a first original Quran manuscript. Number 5, Muslims claim many Persians are anti-Arab and want to reject an Arab prophet, and it's no surprise that poem was found in Persia, implying that it's a fabrication. My response is, that makes no sense, because Iran's population is mostly Shia Muslim, and these Persian Muslims believe in the same Arabic Quran and same Arab prophet which Arab Muslims believe in. Yes, Tisdale's source came from Persia, but as we've just seen, a friend of his in Bahrain also had an edition of poetry attributed to Imr al-Qais, which contained the same words. Bahrain is not Persian, but an Arab Muslim country. The poem therefore seems to have an Arabic source. Now let's deal with the internal evidences. Number 6. Muslims say Tisdale changed his opinion and ended up agreeing with his expert colleague that the poem attributed to Ibn al-Qais was inauthentic. Well, that's true, but I believe Tisdale is wrong here. I will show you why in a minute. In a footnote in the appendix to chapter 2, Tisdale gives the reason for his expert friend's conclusion. He says, quote, "This is the opinion of Sir C.J. Leal, than whom it would be difficult to find anyone better qualified to speak on the subject of ancient Arabic poetry. In a letter which he has kindly sent me regarding the authorship of the lines in question attributed to Ibn al-Qais, he expresses his conviction that they are not his, giving reasons rounded principally upon the style and the meter." Tisdale goes on to say, "His arguments have caused me to modify the opinion on the subject expressed in my Persian work." So we notice here the reason for concluding the poem is not the work of the master poet Ibn al-Qais was that Sir Leal, being an expert in ancient Arabic poetry, apparently saw problems in the style of the poem. But in my opinion, this is not a good reason to automatically dismiss the poem's authenticity, because it's well known that Ibn al-Qais had a drinking problem, as you see here in this Wikipedia article, and he may have composed this poem while drinking. So this easily explains how a master poet could compose poetry which contained weakness of style or some inaccuracy of meaning. It wouldn't be so strange if he was drunk. But another possibility is that the scribes who copied Ibn al-Qais's poem may have made copyist errors. Such errors could occur especially if copying poetry from a different Arabic dialect. Lastly, it's important to point out that in one of his footnotes, Tisdale mentioned that in Bahrain there were scholars of Islam or learned Muslims who apparently thought the poem was original because they found it perplexing or troubling. Number 7. Muslims also claim this poem attributed to Ibn al-Qais cannot be original because there are expressions of monotheism in it. The poetry mentions as-sa'a, or the hour, and the belief in being revived on the day of judgment. They claim this is surprising for a poet known to have a bad moral character, and pre-Islamic Arabs did not believe in resurrection and doomsday. Well, I say there is some evidence that Ibn al-Qais may have been a Christian of some sort. Not a true Christian, a bad one perhaps. Or he may have been influenced by Christianity in some ways. And this means Muhammad was even more likely to plagiarize from him because Muhammad was known to plagiarize from Jewish and Christian sources at other times. If Ibn al-Qais was a pagan, Muhammad would have been less likely to plagiarize from him. As you see here in this Wikipedia article, Ibn al-Qais was known to have contact with influential Christians of that time. So it's not so strange that he wrote some of his poetry while being influenced by biblical concepts. In ending this video, I will conclude that the idea that someone was brave enough to endanger their life to fake this poetry by using verses of the Quran in Iran, above all places, which is a Muslim country with strict Islamic laws and death penalties, is highly unlikely. Tisdale even agreed this is a possible legitimate conclusion because he wrote, quote, "On the one hand, it is difficult to suppose that at any time after the establishment of Islam, anyone would have the daring to parody the Quran by taking passages from it and applying them to the subject to which these lines of poetry refer." This is in his appendix to chapter 2. Yes, Tisdale did change his mind, but he admitted he saw some connection between these lines and the Quran. In the end, he seemed more unsure of himself rather than certain. I believe Tisdale was wrong in his final conclusion because he did not take into account the fact that Ibn al-Qais had a serious drinking problem, and the reason why he could produce some low-quality poetry was because he was under the influence of alcohol. It would be absurd to believe that some unskilled Muslim poet wrote some poor-quality, nonsensical poetry while quoting verses from the Quran, and then falsely attribute that poem back to the pre-Islamic master poet Ibn al-Qais. Such an assumption is utterly foolish, makes no sense, and cannot be maintained. Look, in this video I'm not making the claim the Quran can be classified as poetry, or that its style of recitation should match the style of recitation used for other poetry. But I am making the claim that the actual words, the actual content of Ibn al-Qais's pre-Islamic poetry was taken by Muhammad and incorporated into the Quran, and these are in some cases verbatim, word for word exact matches, which is evidence Muhammad is guilty of plagiarism. So, finally, our last question is, why would Muhammad need to plagiarize poetry? Well, my theory is that in the early part of his so-called prophethood, In the Meccan period, which is when chapters 21, 37, 54, and 93 were revealed, most people didn't believe in Muhammad. So obviously his so-called linguistic miracle, the Quran verses or ayat, were not considered a big deal to most people. So Muhammad had to beautify the Quran with some nice poetry to make it more amazing and acceptable to people. This was achieved by plagiarism. Muhammad knew what he was doing. He knew the power and influence which poetry had upon 7th century Arabian society, and as you see here, this is evidenced by his assassinations of various poets who opposed him. Lastly, I will leave you Muslims with some Arabic recitation. It looks and sounds like the Quran, but it's actually Ibn al-Qays's pre-Islamic poetry. This is meant to give you a better insight into how Ibn al-Qays's pre-Islamic poetry became Muhammad's Quran. It all makes perfect sense now.
دنت الساعة وانشق القمر عن بزاد صاد قلبي ونفر أخور قد خرت في أوصافه ناعس الطرف بعينه حور مر يوم العيد بي في زينة فرراني فتعاطى فعقر.
Therefore, behold, I am against the prophets, saith the Lord, that steal my words every one from his neighbor. Behold, I am against the prophets, saith the Lord, that use their tongues and say, He saith. Behold, I am against them that prophesy false dreams, saith the Lord, and do tell them, and cause my people to err by their lies and by their lightness. Yet I sent them not, nor commanded them. Therefore they shall not profit this people at all, saith the Lord. And when this people, or the prophet, or the priest, shall ask thee, saying, What is the burden of the Lord? Thou shalt then say unto them, What burden? I will even forsake you, saith the Lord.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you won't miss future videos. Also, to support my work, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/don'tconverttoislam. Thank you, and may God our Father bless you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.